Well, thanks first so much for the invitation to be here. I do feel like a bit of a fraud since I don't think I do neurocybernetics or at scale, but thank you anyway for giving me the stage. So I'm going to be telling you today about questions that we've been sort of dabbling with in the last few years around the question of sort of mental models. What do I mean by mental models? Mental models to me really capture what it means to understand, and I think this is really fundamental to our experience as humans. I was thinking yesterday while Bing was talking about behavior, one of my favorite stories from my thesis advisor was that he had an elderly granduncle, and I think this was probably apocryphal because I read this story again in Proust or something, but who was an old Florentinian who, at the age of 30, went to bed and never got up again. He lived his whole life from bed. And so we are able to develop rich enough internal lives that we can actually spend quite happy times without actually moving at all. And so there's sort of a question as one becomes a richer and more complex organism, how much is really about sort of immediate behavior and how much is about the life that we hold inside our heads. And that's what mental models really give to us. So here is Lisbon. This was my picture of Lisbon many years ago. My husband and I actually got married in Portugal, and so we spent part of the time before we got married right here in Alfama and walked around the city. But over time, of course, my conception of Lisbon has stretched, down to all the way to here as the new foundation, the Champalimaud Institute, was opened, and one had to then really think about the center of the city as really having shifted down the coast. So we're constantly updating our mental models. What's useful about having such a mental model, it serves as a scaffold to help us guide our behavior, right, in a dynamic world. So if I am trying to find some interesting places to go see, historical sites, I know where they are. If instead I want to spend my day exploring some old architecture, there's some great locations for that too. If I'm interested in food, yes, I know where to go, or coffee, or great science, I can impose all of that on my mental map and use it in this dynamic fashion by applying different kinds of value functions, right, to make plans. When we think about, it's very obvious, right, to think about maps, physical maps of space as one form of mental model, but there are plenty of mental models that go beyond space. For example, right, if you've spent a few days in Lisbon, now forever after, right, you see this type of architecture or these tiles or these delicious cakes, it will mean Lisbon to you, and I think that's a gift for you for the rest of your lives. One can also think about trying to understand what we're looking at, right? When we go back and we see this beautiful building, what does that mean, right? How do we interpret a building like that? Well, in order to really understand what's going on, we kind of have to have a grasp of European history and where Portugal is sitting in all that and what was happening in the rest of the world at that same time. So all of these are examples, right, of mental maps, of scaffoldings that allow us to impose meaning and structure on our world. And what we'd like to do is understand what that means in neural activity. So what does it mean to understand? So mental models, as we've seen, help us to organize new information in order to rapidly do tasks and solve problems to build our internal life. How are they represented, and how do they organize neural dynamics in order to allow us to solve problems? How do we identify them in neural data? And I think is becoming more and more of interest, how would we even know, right, that an AI model has an internal model or some kind of world model embedded in it? So I'm going to talk through 3 examples, one of them in detail and 3 only very briefly. And this is all work done in collaboration with Beth Buffalo. She's a colleague of mine at the University of Washington, and she has a primate lab. And this, I think, is a great use of the primate model. We imagine that primates are as close as we can get to us and hopefully have something analogous to the kinds of mental models that we use ourselves. Okay, so the first one is a task that was actually done years ago, set up years ago by Yoni Browning when he was a graduate student, co-advised by Beth and me. And so what's going on here is we have monkeys that are navigating in virtual reality environments. And so this monkey, head fixed, but able to navigate in this very kind of realistic-ish environment, is moving through this world. So recording in hippocampus, what do we think hippocampus does? We're really strongly influenced in our thinking about hippocampus, of course, by rodent work, where famously you see very strong place cell coding as animals move through an environment. You see very strong firing at particular locations in space. That in the primate has been less clear, and particularly in virtual reality. What really forces us to think more deeply about what we mean by a cognitive map. And so what's going on in our monkeys as it's moving through this virtual reality environment. So here it is, right? The monkey is moving through a Y maze. So this is a relatively constrained task. So what it's doing is going down a maze. It has to turn left, and then it has to turn right. As it moves down through this central arm, it reaches this decision point where it has to go one way or the other. It gets rewarded for alternating. So there's a little bit of memory involved in remembering which way it went on the last trial. And just to say that a lot of the analysis that you're going to see in the next few slides has been done by John Rookman, who's really been a heroic leader of this work since Yoni graduated. All right, so just to show you what this task looks like, some of you might have seen this before in some of Beth's talks as well. So you're hearing, hopefully you're hearing. Yes, now you're hearing, so it's really loud. So that's the spikes from one neuron as the monkey is navigating through this environment. What you're hearing with that sort of whistling sound is when the animal gets rewarded. Ugh, I'm running out of. Okay, let's play that again. And so the blue circle and the white dot show you where the monkey is looking, right? So it's moving its eyes perfectly freely as it moves through the environment, gets rewarded, and then gets teleported back to the beginning of the maze to restart. All right, so what does neural activity in the hippocampus look like while the animal's performing this task? So just to remind you, here's the maze mapped from above. And what you're looking at here are average firing rates from 550, 600 neurons that were well isolated in this task while the animal is moving through either the left or the right side of the maze. So what you might see is that, at least at a glance, although every neuron, and here it's sort of ordered by its peak firing rate, so you see that, of course, that gives you some kind of sequence, it doesn't look a lot like what one might imagine that place coding would look like, in that you don't see neurons that are firing very precisely at some particular point in space. So let's have a look at that in a few different ways. If instead of looking at these units one by one, as we have here, let's instead look at them as a population. And what we're going to do is compare the representational similarity, right? The firing rate of the population of neurons and how closely it correlates with that response at any other moment in time. So that gives us a matrix like this. So now what we're doing is organizing it by location. So here it's moving down the center arm, it's moving down the side arm, and here it's in the rewarded location, and here's what's happening as it's moving down the other side. And so every square here represents how similar the firing rate of the population is at that moment in time to every other moment in time. So what I hope you'll see is that we don't see something that looks classically place-like, in that you don't see just a diagonal matrix going down, encoding sort of uniquely every moment in every location down this maze by some well-isolated receptive field. In fact, going back to these population responses, you'll see that many of these neurons fire many times throughout the trial. If we instead organize this matrix, instead of by location, by time, so by how far throughout the trial the animal we are, right? So the animals tend to do this task in a very rather stereotyped way. So they don't take exactly the same amount of time every time, but one can normalize, to make sure that we sort of pack the time into the same interval. Now, when we look at the activity and its correlation in this time basis, now I hope you see that the structure that's already kind of emerging here, where we see these kind of blocks, right, of correlations, is even more finely delineated. Right? You see that there are these kind of clean, separated blocks of activity as the animal moves through the sequence of the task. And if you look carefully down the bottom here, now what you're seeing along the axis are now these colors are delineating the epochs of the task. So here, going down the center arm, here's a period where it sort of stays still and makes a choice as to go whether or left or right. This is the side arm. This is the approach, right, to the reward. This is the rewarded period. And this is the intertrial interval. And so what is very helpful, right, about looking at it this way rather than looking at it in space is there's all kinds of stuff, right, going on in the trial that are not, that you kind of lose, right, when you look at it just with respect to space. And now we reveal that, in fact, the activity is really organized by these transitions through these kind of semantically separated epochs of the trial. So to demonstrate what I think you can see here already in this correlation matrix, John did another couple of analyses just to look at this more carefully. So one, what he did was to take all of the activity, all of the population activity, and to do an unsupervised clustering, to just do PCA on all of the neurons, and to project them into a low-dimensional space, and then to cluster based on their responses in this high-dimensional space. And what he found was that the activity organizes into pretty neat clusters. So the clusters are colored by their labels through the unsupervised clustering. Now, if we look at what's going on in time, right, so we start here in this orange, in this purple blob, move to the blue one, move to the green one. Now, these are the colors that are assigned from the unsupervised clustering. We can now compare that with what's going on in terms of the task progression. And you can see that these boundaries are very well aligned with the transitions in the kind of epochs, right, of the task. So just to show you below, right, so if we were to color instead these clusters or these points by where the animal is in the task progression, then we see a color scheme. Of course, the colors now are labeled by task progression, and here they're labeled by their unsupervised cluster, but you can see that the clusters that are being pulled out are exactly overlain. What underscores, I think, this idea that the activity is really pausing the task by the kind of semantic moment in the trial is that because this is virtual reality, we can simply swap in, right, any other environment that we want. So the animal's still doing the same task. It's still doing the alternating Y maze task, but we can replace the scene with any scene that we want, right? So here's 6 different examples. The monkey was run through, say, its home environment, moved to environment B, moved back to environment A, and we did that many times. So here's a few examples of what happens. So here's a couple of individual units through environment A, move to environment B, back to environment A. And you can see that this top neuron changes quite a bit, right? It has quite distinct firing patterns in those 2 environments. So how many neurons do that? Only a very small fraction. So less than 20% of neurons actually remap in the new environment. The vast majority are context invariant. Again, they don't have, this one maybe has more place localized activity, but it's invariant to the visual environment. So most of the responses don't depend on the visual context. Instead, they just depend on where the animal is in the trial. So what does this tell us? It suggests that in this case, hippocampus seems to be encoding, rather than a kind of spatial veridical map of the environment, something more like task semantics. we see that the neural representations are kind of chunking the task into these cognitively relevant segments. Now, that's cool and exciting, but this is obviously a very simple very simple schema where the only thing the animal has had to learn is this very simple alternating environment with a very simple geometry. We would like to go further with thinking about what internal maps look like, or cognitive maps or internal models. So we turned to another data set from Beth's lab, and this one was taken before I arrived, and it's many years ago, and so we've been struggling to get something useful out of this, but you'll see why it was worth it, because it's such a rich data set. So in this case, what the animal is doing is a multidimensional inference task, and some of you will be familiar with a version of this, which is something like the Wisconsin card sorting test, right? So this is a common test used in psychology to test people's cognitive flexibility. This is not exactly the classic test, and what the monkey was trained to do was these 4 images would come up, right? And what it would have to do is choose one of them. And so here's how the trial goes, right? It has to first fixate on a cross in the middle for 500 milliseconds. It's allowed to look across the field for up to 4 seconds. At some point, it has to make a choice, and it denotes that choice by fixating on one of those cards for 800 milliseconds, at which time it's either rewarded or not. And the reward is based on one of these features of the card. So you see that every card has 3 different features. It has a color, a shape, and a texture. The animal doesn't know that, right? It doesn't know that that's how the game works, but it eventually figures it out. And it doesn't know what the current feature is. The current feature gets changed after some criteria. So after the animal gets it right for some number of times, then uncued to the animal, the rule will be changed. All right, so let's just play the game, right? So you see that set of stimuli, you choose one. If it's not the right one, right, you don't get rewarded. You get another combination of stimuli. You make another choice. In this case, you do get rewarded. Okay, so you have a new set of choices that come up. What are you going to do? Okay, let's say you think that it's the texture, right, that's driving the reward, so you might choose this one. Nope. This time, you get another opportunity to choose. You choose this one because maybe it was the fact that it was a square. Nope. So hopefully you all would now choose the blue one because that's the only remaining feature of this card. But obviously, right, it takes quite a bit of experience with this game, right, to figure out that that's what's going on, right? So you get it right, and so in the next trial, you choose the blue one, right? So hopefully that's clear. So after the animal gets it right n times, the rule will switch. And so this is an example of a task that is active, right? It's an active sensing task where the animal has to actively search around the screen, freely behaving, and self-paced trials, right? So it does this at its own pace. So monkeys, when they're doing this task, behave a little bit differently to humans, right? They show relatively slow updates compared with humans. We have a whole data set of humans doing this, and even neural recordings from humans. This was performed on a whole bunch of people that were undergoing surgery for epilepsy. I don't have any data from that to talk about, but we at least have the behavior. So here's how humans do, here's how monkeys do. Clearly, humans are getting it pretty quickly and solving it. What is different between humans and monkeys? Both, they take much longer, and monkeys tend to perseverate, right? Once they've decided on a rule, it takes them a lot longer to let go of that rule. So what is the mental model, right, that the animal might be using to do this task? So one naive, oversimplified idea is that maybe it's learning a lookup table, right? There are 64 different combinations of cards. Maybe it just has to learn after a lot of experience which of those 64 are rewarded and which aren't, right? That would be a really stupid way to do it, but certainly doable, right? It could be completely pixel-based. Alternatively, the way we talk through, right, when we're doing the task, it could be feature-based. It could realize, right, that there's an order to this task, that the features, it needs to decompose the images into these 12 features, and based on which of the 12 features it's getting rewarded for, accumulate evidence toward any one of those features, and based on that, make the correct choice. So what one of my students did was to model a bunch of different possible strategies, right? This naive strategy, simple lookup table, an optimal strategy, which was the one we talked through, right, where you test each feature in turn, and then you rule out hypotheses. An example, because in some ways this is something like a bandit task, right? So a win-stay lose switch algorithm is something that people often think is what animals are doing when they're faced with, say, a two-armed bandit. That if you get a reward, you stay with that same side. If you get it wrong, you'll make a switch. Obviously here, it's an ambiguous task, right? When you get it right or wrong, you don't know exactly why, because there are 3 different features, so one has to think carefully about how to implement a version like that, but my student John did that. Alternately, it could be doing something like reinforcement learning, right? It might really know that there is a feature basis. It might have some belief over which of those features is the rewarded one, and on every trial, based on feedback, update what potential feature was driving the reward. So we fit all of these models, we fit all the parameters of them, tested it against the data, and ranked them by the log likelihood of the data. And what John found was that monkeys were best fit by the category of models that all were in a kind of reinforcement learning class. Next best were more optimal models, and then way down the stack were win-stay lose switch or naive. If you do the same with humans, you find that they are best fit by an optimal approach. Not quite optimal, you forget, right? So it's hard to keep in mind which things you've seen already, so there's some leakiness to the memory. And then we also see a rank ordering where next best fits are kind of reinforcement learning type approaches, and then of course the naive turns out to be worst. So the best model that John found was this sort of feature-based reinforcement learning, with very simple idea that you have 3 features on the card that you choose. If that card is correct, then you increase all of the probabilities of those 3 features toward 1. If you get it incorrect, you decrease them toward 0. The ones that you don't get any information about, you're gradually forgetting, right? So your belief about them sort of is decaying away towards 0. So the human and monkey differences, what we saw there, as I said, learning rates are very different. Humans use reasoning, right, but they're memory limited. Monkeys do something more like reinforcement learning. That is, they slowly build habits rather than they sort of reason about what's going on. Humans discard non-important information, while monkeys perseverate, and they forget slowly. So that was the best fitting model, but in the next part of the talk, I'm going to talk instead about a different model, which is very similar, but a little bit different, a little bit more mathematically elegant. So Patrick then appeared, who decided instead to fit the data using a Bayesian belief update. And so in this case, it's actually very similar to the reinforcement learning model. It fits very similarly, the data, but it has some properties that are a bit more elegant. And so in this case, what you're doing is you're maintaining a belief, right, about each feature of the card, denoted by the Z, which is the probability that that is the rewarded feature given the history of choices and rewards. There's a belief update rule. So on a subsequent trial, there's some reward function, where if you got a reward on the last trial for a given feature of the card, and this is the vector of features on that card, you get some positive amount if you got it right, and you get some different amount otherwise. If this were a perfect model, right, if the animal really got the model perfectly, this would be 1, right, if you get it right, and 0 otherwise. We assume that the animal doesn't have a perfect model of what's going on, so we allow some slop in these parameters. And so then we also assume that the animal's policy is just to choose the maximum likelihood value, right? So it just chooses the feature for which its current belief is the highest. All right, so why, just to compare with the feature RL, so it's similar, right? There's the basic idea is that one maintains a vector of beliefs. The prediction performance is almost identical. Some dissimilarities. One is that it requires that there's some model, the animal has some model of the state transitions, which we had to guess. And also, the increment with this positive feedback is no longer just +1, -1, it's multiplicative, so it depends on the current state. And the belief decrement, there's no explicit decrement in belief. It's not through memory loss, but through normalization, because we're always maintaining a probability distribution over the beliefs. So technical differences, but probably relevant. All right, so this model predicts the behavior really well. So here is what you get if you track, say, the perseveration of the monkeys. So we fit the model, we find the best parameters. The green is the model, the solid line's the model, the rest is the data and its standard deviation. So we beautifully tracks, the error rate and the learning rate of the monkey after a switch for these two different animals. It also predicts aspects of the behavior that we didn't include, right? So one can ask, as a function of belief state value, how long is the monkey taking, right, to perform the task? And we see this very nice relationship between the decision time, how long it has to search before it makes a decision, that scales very nicely with the current belief state value. So what is good about this, and all of you who use behavioral models to parse your data will hopefully agree, is that models, these behavioral models, let us infer something about what's going on under the hood, right? The animal has some thought process that we don't have direct access to, but the model gives some estimate of what's going on, right? So we have this sequence, all we can observe from the outside, its behavior, it makes choices, it gets them wrong or right. Over this period, the hidden rule is that the feature was a triangle, then it switches to some other feature. For a while, the monkey will get it wrong, and then, bit by bit, start to get it right, and eventually figure it out. And so if we take a snapshot at some moment in time, let's say at this trial, we at trial J, right, there's some distribution of beliefs over all of those features. If it gets it right on trial J+1, then it will increment, right, its belief about triangle by some positive amount and decrease everything else. Similarly, after a transition like this, it had a very high belief that it was a triangle, gets it wrong, and now that belief is going to decay away. All right, so we have a time-varying estimate, right, of the monkey's belief in these 12 different features. So now let's turn to neural data. Now this, as you'll see, was challenging, right? So this is amazing data. This was taken in Beth's lab using a multi-channel microdrive, in fact, 2 multi-channel microdrives. These are gray drives. So 200 electrodes that were penetrated all the way down to the hippocampus, which is kind of a feat. And so not just hippocampus, in fact, but all over the brain. So these electrodes were distributed many different places, 220 channels, multiple locations, recording over 39 days, 1,000 sessions. And so all of this gives us, in 2 different monkeys, one monkey had 2 drives, one monkey had 1 drive. We have spikes from, this is my version of at scale. This is as big as it gets, right? It's 1,500 neurons, roughly speaking, in these 2 animals. So amazing data set, right? It's kind of brain-wide activity at the single unit level over many, many trials, many, many days. So fabulous. Also kind of horrific, right? Why? We have 220 channels all over the brain, 1,500 neurons from, 18 different areas. So we don't have a lot of neurons from any one area, right? It's highly distributed over long periods of time, non-stationarities, blah, blah, blah. So complicated data set. What can we get out of it, right? So how do we approach this problem and this data? We've heard a lot about manifolds. It would be really awesome to be able to estimate manifolds and understand the dynamics of what's going on as the monkey is performing this task. Of course, you will all recognize that with data like this, we cannot fit manifolds because we don't have at any time enough simultaneous recording from the same neurons over long periods of time, because every day it's a different set of neurons. So that really limits us in performing more modern and sophisticated analyses. So instead, we turn to our great workhorse, which is decoding, right? So we can ask what in the neural activity is correlated with some external variable. So at every time, we can assemble firing rates, pseudopopulations, and then ask if we weight them, right, with some set of weights, how much do we learn about, can we learn about some external variable, right? So what external variables do we want to look at? Well, what neural structure are we looking for in order to see whether our model has any legs, right? To see whether there is such an internal model going on in the animal. So we would like to see that stimulus features are represented. We'd like to see that there are representations of the reward, representations of the current belief, and hopefully even the dynamics of the belief update via the reward feedback. All right, so how well do we do? So first, card features are decodable. Shouldn't be too surprised about that, right? You can decode which color, which shape, which pattern is on the card with pretty high accuracy from our population. This is during the time at which the animal is actually fixating on one of the cards. And so we get quite high accuracy decoding. What's kind of interesting is that the features at some point disappear right after you've made the choice. And we see that we can continue to decode really quite well for some period of time after the cards have left the screen. So which are the neurons that are carrying this information? Turns out that we can find that out by looking at the strength, right, of the weights and how strongly different neurons in the brain are being weighted. Here's those set of weights. So we fit a decoder at every time, right, throughout the course of the trial. Here's the weights that apply for color, shape, and pattern. I know this is hard to see, but what I hope you can take out of that is that the neurons that are contributing strongly to the decoding are really everywhere. They're distributed all the way across the brain. Every region that we look in has some neurons that carry some of that information. So what we'd like to do is understand sort of the dynamics of this encoding across time. So we talked before about looking at representational similarity, right? How similar the firing patterns at one time are compared to at any other time throughout the course of our Y-maze task. Now what we're going to do instead is apply that kind of analysis to the decoder itself, right? So if we train a decoder at one time, how well does that do in extracting information at some other time? So let's look at that. So we build a similar kind of matrix, but now this is about kind of cross-decodability across time. And now you see something that should look a little bit familiar from the Y-maze task, is that we see this kind of block structure, right? So there's a decoder that works well prior to the choice. There's a different one, right, that's active during the choice. And then there's a transition during the feedback, and perhaps, maybe not surprisingly, while the animal is no longer seeing the features, the representation of those features moves into a completely different subspace, right? A different set of neurons are encoding that card identity, those features during the feedback period. So how much of this is just visual, right? It's driven by vision. So what we can do is have a look at the decoder during the choice period and then compare that, right? So we don't just have activity measured during the choice. We actually have it through the whole trial while the animal is fixating briefly on all the other stimuli that it looks at. We can apply the same decoder to that brief 200 millisecond period while it's briefly fixating on other cards. And we're equally well able to decode the features on those cards, even in these very brief eye movements. Turns out that decoder is pretty much the same decoder, right? So if we fit the decoder during the choice period and we apply it to the briefly fixated features, we do fine, right? So it's the same decoder during the visual period. Okay, next thing we'd like to understand is encoding of feedback. So feedback should not be hard, right? There is a big reward that the animal gets in the feedback period, or no big reward, and so it will be disappointed. And so that is a huge signal, which we can decode with 100% accuracy. What you notice here is that you can also decode the feedback prior to the feedback, so also probably shouldn't be surprising to you, because when the animal is doing well, it knows that it's going to be rewarded. So with some fraction, you can see here a little bit of decodability, right? Some correlation prior to the onset of the feedback. All right, so again, I showed you, this is the same data I showed you before. What we saw was that visual, the stimulus features are represented everywhere in the brain. Turns out, of course, feedback is also represented everywhere in the brain. In fact, all the representations we see for anything are distributed all over the brain. So what we're going to do is to group neurons into their area and now treat them by region. Right? One would like to understand, we do believe that one does hope that different parts of the brain do different things. Is that, in fact, the case? One thing that we can see is that the encoding of the feedback does have different timing in different regions. So relief to see that, although the representation is super distributed, where that information comes online is kind of graded throughout the brain. So if we look, we see that there's even anticipatory responses in the amygdala. And the last one, the slow, the basal ganglia, spikes right up as soon as the feedback appears. And the hippocampus is kind of the last to get the information about feedback. We shouldn't be surprised to see reward signals in the hippocampus. Many people have reported that. But as you can see, that's kind of the last area to find out about it. It's kind of cool to see what structure we can get by looking at the different regions. So we can look at this decoder stability across areas. So basal ganglia shows something quite interesting, which is that when the feedback, at the onset of the feedback, you get this huge signal that now you can see that it is correlated, right? The decoder that's fit immediately after the feedback comes on is kind of the same decoder that's providing that anticipatory response to the feedback. But there is a transition, right? It does something initially, and then it switches to a different kind of decoder after time. Whereas other regions, like anterior cingulate, are much more block-like, right? So it's sort of the same decoder that's working throughout, and also in hippocampus, right? It takes a while to switch on, but then same decoder is in effect throughout the entire feedback period. All right, so we've seen representations of stimulus features, representations of reward. Can we find any representations of the current belief? I mean, that's really the key thing. Evidence for beliefs is hard to find, right? Why? Because in this task, our belief vector is quite high-dimensional. In a lot of tasks where people have had success in doing this, they have had maybe 2 different choices. Here we have 12 different choices. Finding something that's a 12-dimensional vector space, potentially, is really hard to fish out, particularly in this kind of data where we have lots of non-distinguisharities. Furthermore, the animal is doing the task at its own pace. So when and where in the trial is the belief activated, right? When should we be even looking for it? So both of those are complexities. So one thing that might sort of save us is that, a really interesting idea from Tim Bushman's lab, that there may be some kind of attentional template, right? So certainly I get the feeling when I'm doing the task is that what I'm doing is sort of starting to ignore irrelevant features of the card, that the meaning of as I learn that, say, it's blue, I just look for blue and I don't even notice the other features on the card. And so that, that sort of fits the idea that there's almost like a visual template for that sort of encodes the rule. Is that the case here, right? So I showed you earlier that we can decode information about the visual features throughout the trial. What happens now if we use our belief state model to sort trials into cases where the animal has high belief in a given feature versus low belief in a given feature? That's what we do here. We see that during the visual period, there is no change, right? There is no change in the way that the feature is represented. So there's no direct filtering of the information at the input side. Then we tried this, right? We continued decoding into the feedback period, and now you see this separation, right? So according to trials in which you have high belief, it looks here as though that feature is represented during the feedback period in this sort of much more vivid way somehow, right? So we thought, we've finally found some correlation, right, of the feature. But then the ghost of Ken Harris loomed above us. So if you know Ken Harris's work, he has, I think, really contributed very valuably to the literature in pointing out the danger of nonsense correlations, right? That there are all kinds of correlations in your data that you really have to take good care of as not to find spurious relationships. And so this task is very vulnerable to that kind of problem, right? Because when the animal is starting to get it right, when it has, a high belief in a given thing, it's been doing that for a while, right? So there's all kinds of history effects that really shift your baseline from chance level to something that's very far from chance. So we really had to rethink the way that we did this analysis. We throw out that very appealing result and went back to square one. And what Patrick realized would be our most effective way to both solve the problem of high dimensionality and deal with these spurious correlations is that he chose examples of trials very carefully so that we avoid these issues. So he chose all the trials on which a given feature was present, let's say triangle, and in which the animal got it right? So it can't be affected by the outcome of the trial, and the feature that we care about is always there. And then he divided this data set into 3 different groups. One in which, according to the model, the animal had high confidence that triangle was the appropriate feature. Ones in which there was high confidence that it was choosing that card for some other reason. One of the other features on the card was one with high confidence. And then all the other trials, which are that it didn't really have high confidence about any of the features, right? And so this means that we're always looking at trials that are well controlled. They're under the same conditions. The triangle is always there. It's always getting it right, but under these 3 different conditions relative to our belief state model. And now this allows us to do kind of binary decoding, right? We can ask, in this case, how well can we decode that the animal had a preference for triangle versus anything else? And then we can bundle these guys together and ask, how confident was the animal in whatever feature it was, right? Whether it was triangle or something else versus that it didn't know what it was. And so this is probing our belief state structure in these 2 different ways, both what its preference is for and how confident was it in that choice. All right, so preference. So can we tell which feature is the current rule? And now we find that we're able to decode, right, that preference actually throughout the trial, right, at all moments throughout the presentation. So these are, again, organized so that we're looking near the time. So this is the choice period, and during the feedback, you see decodability of the relevant feature of whatever the animal has in mind as the correct feature prior to its choice, during the choice, and into the feedback period. This is a free viewing paradigm, right? So why did we particularly lock to this moment? We can also have a look by organizing all of the responses locked instead to the time that the cards actually appear. And it's interesting to look in the pre-trial period, right? So this is before the cards are even on the screen. We can see that we can decode whatever feature the animal has in mind, right, that it's eventually going to choose down the track, even during that pre-trial period. And so right throughout the trial, we find evidence, right, for an encoding of its knowledge about that current feature. Where is that? It's everywhere, again, right? So if we now divide our data up into different regions and we ask how well we can decode that information, you can see, right, that all these different regions, amygdala, basal ganglia, hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, all have significant decodability of the rule, and more or less throughout the entire trial. The representations, however, shift continuously, right? So rather than there being kind of a unique decoder that sort of works at all times, what this structure is telling you is that it's different sets of neurons, right, that are encoding that information at the same accuracy, but moving all the time. And I think this is something that we do get out of this kind of decoding analysis that sometimes can be lost when we go into a low-dimensional neural space, is that what this would suggest, right, is that the relevant features or the relevant vectors that are capturing that information are actually, moving all the time. And so that would imply quite a high dimensional feature space that might be very difficult to find in a PCA type analysis. All right, so hopefully this convinces you somewhat that we have some kind of representation of the feature belief that's encoded in this activity. What Patrick is currently doing is looking to see if there's any geometric organization of these feature vectors. Certainly we do think about these as grouped, right? There's shape, there's color, there's pattern. Those vectors that decode those things kind of organized in any interesting way. That's to come. Now what we can do is look at the confidence. So remember, we defined confidence through the belief distribution. This is maybe a more general way of thinking about confidence. So here's how the belief distribution updates through time as the animal is going through the trial. If it's very confident about something, that distribution is very peaked. If it's not confident about a given feature, if its belief distribution is very broad, we say it's not confident, right? So it turns out that we could look at, say, entropy, right, of these belief distributions, and then ask how well we can decode that quality, right, if it's peaked or not peaked. Turns out that you can decode, that definition of confidence very well across time and again, right, all over the brain. What is sort of interesting is that in the sense that Stefano Fusi introduced, confidence is sort of abstractly represented. So, the way that the Fusi lab have sort of defined abstract is that you have a decoder that you test in that you train in one condition, and then you apply it to a different condition, right? So here, this is if you use all the data, right, to decode confidence, or you train and test, on random subsets of data, you get this high degree. If you just train it on one feature and you try to decode confidence, you don't do as well because you're using less data. But if you then test that same decoder on using for a different feature, then you do almost as well. So in whatever basis confidence is being represented, it's kind of feature independent. So why might that be? What we might be seeing here is this might be some evidence for the dynamics kind of living in these two different manifolds, right? When you have low confidence, your behavior is really different, right? You look around more at all the different features. You're in a kind of, pondering mode, right? So we might think about that as kind of an explore mode, whereas when you know what you're doing, you kind of look right there directly at the feature that you know. And so that's a very different dynamics that may well live in a different manifold. All right, so we did here see that different regions did differ in the time course of the representation of confidence. So back to our binary decoding, we can now apply that to different brain areas. And we see that there's much more structure in this, in fact. Right? So here, before the cards appear, there's a strong representation of confidence in the prefrontal cortex, which perhaps shouldn't be too surprising. And then not much representation during the choice, right? While you're looking at it, doesn't really matter how confident you are. When you're back in the feedback period, then again, we see a big contribution, and this time from the amygdala. Right, so maybe what we're looking at here is sort of the dynamics of choice, that prefrontal cortex is maybe playing a big role in, whereas after you've already made the choice, this is really the dynamics of updating, and then we see different regions kind of coming to the fore and playing a larger role. All right, so that's what we know about our representations of current belief. Let's see if we can see any evidence for the dynamics of belief update via the feedback. Ooh. Yes, okay, that's red. Doesn't mean I'm in negative time. Just okay. All right, so evidence of trial-by-trial belief update. So this is what our model says, right? So what we want to know is by how much, from one trial to the next, do our beliefs change, right? What's our delta change in belief if we chose X and we got it right, if we chose X and we got it wrong, or if we just got it right or wrong without conditioning on what feature it was. So we need to, test that because it's this Bayesian update, it's not a fixed increment, right, that we're adding as we would be doing if we were reinforcement learning. And it's Bayesian, so it's a, multiplicative update, so we just sample that from our model. Now we can do the same thing at our data. What we're now going to do is look at the firing rates of our population projected onto the feature basis, right? So we now have a decoder for every feature. We can now ask how did the firing rate change along that feature axis from trial to trial after getting it right or wrong. And so what you see, so now we're projecting onto the preference axis. We see very nice sort of replication of this, right? So the firing rates along that preference axis, trial by trial, change by an amount that sort of with a pattern, right, that corresponds to what we're seeing in the model. When it gets it wrong, it decreases the firing rate. If we instead project our firing rates along the confidence axis, now it shouldn't matter whether it's feature X or any other feature, right? So confidence change should be invariant to whatever the feature was, and that is also suggested by our confidence axis being kind of feature independent, and that's exactly what we see. So confidence increases, right, if you get it right, it decreases if you get it wrong, doesn't matter what feature it was. So that is really consistent with everything I've shown you so far, and also nice consistency between the model and the data. We can probe it in more detail, right? So the belief updates are belief state independent because of this Bayesian update rule. We can divide the cases where we chose X and got it correct into cases where we started out with a low confidence that that was the right feature. We would expect in those cases, we would increase our belief about that feature by a lot when we started with low confidence. When we already had high confidence, we should increase it but not by as much. And if we had high confidence in something that was different to X, we shouldn't increase it very much at all because we can ascribe our success to that other feature. Similarly, when you get it wrong, right, we expect to see a pattern like this, that if you chose X and you got it wrong, if you had low belief that it was X, you shouldn't change it at all. If you had high belief that that was the right feature and you get it wrong, you should really decrease your belief in that feature. And if you had a high belief in something else and it wasn't X, it shouldn't matter. We see, again, very similar patterns across the data, right? So here are the firing rates projected onto the preference axis. And we see the same kind of effect that when the belief in that feature was low, you see a large firing rate change along that preference axis, and not much change for these other two conditions. And similarly, a much stronger negative change in firing rate when it chose X, when it got it wrong, when it had a high belief that it was X. Okay, so these dynamics of belief updates seem to align, right, with our update model. So just to summarize all that, what I've shown you is that we've used behavior to parse mental models to try to extract these representations from the data. Behavioral modeling is really a key tool, I think, to interpret brain-wide activity during these kind of complex decision-making tasks and pose for us sort of a hypothesis for the algorithm that we can then look for in the data. So we were able to decode stimulus features, feedback, and the rule. We can evaluate these trial-by-trial belief updates. We see that the belief updates follow the expected pattern from a Bayesian update rule. We can also decode confidence independent of the rule, and that presumably directs the internal dynamics of the system toward explore, exploit. And we see that these representations are highly distributed and dynamic. And this is something I think of a disappointment for monkey people, maybe, because there's maybe canard out there. We know now from all the data that mice, everything is all over the place. People have always felt that monkeys are, and humans are much more modular. And I think our data maybe somewhat contradict that, at least if we're thinking about these computations as being distributed processes. It's not coming out quite so clearly that they are doing very different things. I mean, maybe some of the temporal data suggesting, right, that signals are propagating at different times throughout the brain, but all of the regions are implicated in all of these representations. Okay, so challenges here. This is a super difficult task for monkeys. It takes them months to learn. It's very unnatural, right? Very unnatural sort of example of an internal model. This was a very rich data set, but a very limited and complicated one because of all the issues that I've talked about. So in my last minute or two, I'm just going to show you where we're going with this kind of work now with Beth. So working with a new task paradigm that is infinitely more fun, I think, for the animal and also for us because they learn it very quickly. So this is the task, super fun. I love doing this. So this is blackberries. Washington State has amazing blackberries. So you walk past a blackberry bush, you cannot help but forage, right? So foraging, as more and more people are realizing, is a great paradigm, I think, for neuroscience going forward. How are we using it? We're using it to try to expose internal models or mental models through the advantage of the foraging paradigm, which is that animals are super motivated to do it. It's a very naturalistic behavior. They learn it really quickly, but we can impose upon the foraging task different kinds of underlying schema in the way that items in the environment are rewarded. So here's what we have. We have monkey foraging in this virtual reality environment. This is all just amazing work from Sophie Landy. We have two different versions of the task, one in which what sets the value of the object is its color, right? They have three different colors. Some feature of the object is what's rewarded, and they just have to learn that value map over that feature. And another case in which all the objects are the same color, and what defines their value is where they are in the environment, right? So in this case, they don't really have to care. They don't even have to notice, right, where the objects are. They just go after the color. And in this case, they really have to pay attention to space. So I'll just show you how they do with this. So this is the very first time, right, that they do the color task. So they like, they know how to move the joystick, and they know how to approach objects. So what you're hearing is, in the beeps, is how much reward it's getting as it approaches any of these rewards or any of these balls. So it gets 2. Okay, it gets a lot of reward for the blue, okay. Now by trial 15, right, same session, rapidly turns around, scans for a blue, ignores the green, goes straight for the next blue. So you can see that, within this same trial, the animal has gotten the idea, it's understood the reward map, and it makes a route through the environment that gives it optimal reward. Just to emphasize that it has a limited time, it has 30 seconds, right, to do this task, and so it's really motivated to get the most reward it can. So here's an example now of us moving through space. This is harder for it to learn, in fact. So now it's rewarded by where the objects are according to this spatial map. Trial 1. So those are the high rewarded ones in that corner. So trial 16. So every time it comes into the maze, or into the environment, it's put in a different place, so its starting location is always different, has to look around. But as you see, it got the nearest one to it and then went straight to the high rewarded part of the arena. So they learn to do it super fast, right? This is just showing you how rapidly they're learning to exploit the highest rewarded stimuli. What we've seen in preliminary data is that now we have neuropixels recordings finally in hippocampus. This was challenging. Hippocampus is really deep. It's hard to insert neuropixels there. So finally, this is online. When the animal is doing the color task, if we sort the reward, we sort the approach to the target according to the color, we see separation according to color. If we sort them by zone in the spatial task, we see separation. If we look at the color task grouped by zone, we don't see any separation, right? So what this tells us is essentially there's very little spatial coding when space doesn't matter to the performance of the task. Right, so you can see that this new task paradigm just gives us a lot of opportunities to do fun stuff, right? It lets us rapidly probe new instantiations of schemas, new schemas. It's going to permit us to scan through different learning paradigms and hopefully uncover something about the circuit implementation and to track in real time, right, the emergence and evolution of these mental models as one switches from one schema to another, as one learns a new paradigm. All right, big picture, so mental models. What our challenge is here is to try to reveal algorithms of cognition in data. I think it's worth asking ourselves, are all algorithms expressible as dynamical systems? They're an incredibly powerful tool. We're all I'm a physicist, I love dynamical systems. Is everything going to look like a dynamical system, or are there things in this type of cognitive maps that can't be easily expressed that way? I think we got quite a lot here out of decoding. So manifolds versus decoding, I'm not sure that it's a dichotomy, but the decoding revealed for us that there is this representation, right, that's changing all the time. If one had a priori found a low-dimensional representation, we would be losing information about where that representation was moving over time. One of the key things that I think we're all struggling with how to do is how do you form non-parametric graphs of relationships? So, our images of Lisbon, right? So how do we tag those things as Lisbon, right? What is the nature of the change in internal representation that binds those things together? And I think we need to think quite deeply, and there's interesting work going on out there about how to express relationships in neural data that encode things that are not parametrically represented in a manifold structure, but rather as sort of graphs of meaning over very distributed objects. All right, so I think understanding how we construct and update our inner world is really next frontier. Not that we've answered everything else, but we're starting to be at a point where we can think about trying to do this. And I think very naturally, I think part of it will be done here at the Center for the Unknown. All right, so just to thank my lab and all the people who have contributed this, and my funding, and you guys for your attention. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great talk. Lots to think about. I think we have time for maybe one, hopefully 2 questions, but yeah. I think Joe at the back.
Hi, Adrienne. Great talk. I was wondering, I mean, the models you talked about were mostly kind of more computational or algorithmic models, and I wonder whether you've pushed into kind of more implementational level models. In particular, I wonder how well one could use something inspired by, say, a meta-learning model to give you kind of similar performance that you see in the belief model.
So. Meta-learning meaning that...
I'm referring particularly to this work by Jane Wong and Matt Botvinnik, where they basically use they train a recurrent neural network to encode the state of various tasks, and it can produce this sort of like inference-like behavior, but in a devilishly simple way.
I think nothing here is inconsistent with that, right? So one still has to, one would still ask, I think, a meta-learned system whether or not it has learned an internal basis, right, for the feature space of the task. Very often, people will build that into their meta-learned model and then let it find the algorithm. I'm sure that what the animal is doing here is not learning in the real sense. I'm sure it's in context inference, right? This is an inference problem. And because it's taken 3 months to learn to do this task, nothing I'm saying here makes any claims about learning versus inference, right? So really the claim with the point we're getting at is what is the structure of the inference problem that the animal has built over time? And can we see any evidence that it has converted complex visual imagery, right, into the relevant feature space that would let you solve this task in an inference-like way? So no, I totally agree with you, and we're playing a lot also with meta-learning models, not so much for this task because we're maybe for the foraging task, but I think I'm super struck by the success of those models, and I love the idea, and I think it's very relevant that you can do a lot of smart stuff in a fully frozen network because your dynamics implement for you the inference that you need to do, and I'm sure that that's what's going on here.